Good morning to everyone. You are very courageous to start at 9:15 with a session on the future of global governance. And let me start with a gloomy picture of global governance, and then we will try to move into a more positive outlook. If we look at the current crisis in the Middle East, I think it is telling on where global governance stands right now. We have a Security Council paralyzed, not paralyzed to find a way to make peace or to stop the war, paralyzed in trying to approve a ceasefire 1 year. We have the UN agency in charge of refugees in Gaza under political fire. We have the UN military mission under fire, UNIFIL. We have the Secretary General as a persona non grata. And the ceasefire that was produced yesterday, handled by, not in Geneva, not in Vienna, not in New York, but by United States and France. It's a good news, but it's telling them something is not working. And the session we have today, and I will introduce our guest, our panelist, aims to discuss the issue, can we restart? Can we relaunch international cooperation? And can we restart from MENA, the topic that we are addressing in this 3 days Rome dialogue? I'm very glad to have in the panel Melita Gabric, State Secretary from Slovenia, from Minister of Foreign Affairs. On my left, Staffan de Mistura. I think you have been at MED every year in the last 10 years, or more or less. Staffan, in different capacities. Staffan de Mistura, personal envoy of the Secretary General for Western Sahara, and Mayer Al-Ansari, advisor to the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and official spokesperson in Qatar, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have seen you on CNN very often in the last year. But let me start with all of you with a quick comment on the news of the day. I mentioned already, last night we had a ceasefire in Lebanon. Let's be optimistic and realistic. What's the good news and the bad news on this ceasefire? Let me start from you, Staffan.
3 points, but short. Point number 1 is very good news. We were all waiting for it. The people were waiting for it. Second comment, the devil is in the detail. We know it. And the third one is, there can be an epidemic of conflicts, and we have had it, but it can be also an epidemic of ceasefires. And this changes the perception that the whole thing is moving only in one direction. So it is good news. Now starts the real work, and we can talk about it later.
Thank you. Please, your comment?
I would reiterate what the distinguished co-panelist just said. This indeed is a very good news. We welcome this news, and we hope that it will lead to, that this ceasefire will lead to sustainable, permanent peace, security. At the same time, I would also like to emphasize that we hope that a ceasefire will happen soon also in Gaza.
Thank you very much. Mahed, you've been working on a couple of ceasefires recently.
Thank you, Paolo. I mean, the most important thing here is that this is good news, especially and strategically, because it's a very rare and a much-needed success for international cooperation that we need in order to maintain the trust in the international norms and the international system. For so many years now, we've been seeing failure after failure of the international community, failure after failure of international organizations. We hope that this success would drive on a momentum to regain trust in the international system.
Thank you. Let's start with our conversation. Staffan, good news, but as mentioned, we had failures and failures before. And the conflict in Gaza and Lebanon highlighted once again the division among major powers, but also tension between the so-called global south and the rest of the world. And are there ways to, given the current structure, to work around these blockages, and what could have been done, what can be done while waiting for a restructuring of the entire structure?
First of all, the UN is there because it was created for a purpose. Of course, it is like an elder gentleman which needs to be refreshed constantly and renovated. But it's not easy because it's a picture of a Polaroid picture of 1945, and there are many missing points. So we recognize that. You said it, the UN Security Council, there are many UNs. We saw yesterday with Kalskau, the UN Humanitarian, the UN Security Council, the UN Secretariat, the Secretary General. Each of them play a role. But the Security Council is paralyzed. Let's recognize it. It's true and it's bad news. I see it all the time and it's been blocked. But it can be unblocked. Once I saw it in the past during the Cold War, it was even more paralyzed. I was frustrated like a young diplomat, like many of you, by seeing no discussion, but we were finding a way. The second aspect is that the Security Council is paralyzed, but that doesn't mean that we cannot do something anyway. And the third one is, let's see if, for instance, perhaps with the new US administration, every time there is a change, can be a new atmospherics inside the Security Council. And there are some indications of that. If that takes place, we will be able to perhaps have a moment in which there can be more agreements. Last point, reform. Are we going to have a reform? Difficult. Why? Because the veto power will veto any reform. So we have to go beyond that. And there are many ways. One is using much more the General Assembly, and we have seen it in the past. Second is, when they are blocked, we can have, and we have had it now, other players. Qatar is a very good example. The US yesterday in Lebanon, it was not done by the UN. You saw it. It was done by the US with France and support of some countries like Qatar. But i pieces, i pezzi rotti del mosaico will be passed on to the UN. You will see UNIFIL having a much bigger role with Italy, France, Spain being part of it, and other countries like India. And you will see the resolution 1701 at the Security Council to actually become refreshed and revamped. So we may have to be modest. Modest means we were not, and we should perhaps not be always in the lead, but we are the ones who then pick up the pieces and make it implementable.
But Staffan, you mentioned rightly so that in the past the Cold War was much colder than it is now. I mean,
yes.
It was real. Okay, but Dag Hammarskjöld at that time invented Chapter 6.5, the peacekeeping, which did not exist. So given the constraint of the chart, without reforming the chart, he found an incredible role which is still around. The UNIFIL is part of that, by the way, after many years. Do you see any kind of creativity? Because you mentioned a few examples. The General Assembly, honestly, we have seen the General Assembly both on Ukraine and Gaza, but that didn't have a great impact. Utilizing, I mean, it was a picture of the division of the entire world. But do you see any example of creativity right now?
Well, I do, and I want to see it. Just yesterday we had a mention to that. There was sometimes a complete paralysis at the beginning of the Ukrainian war. You remember it. It was completely paralyzed. The UN, no one got veto of the big two powers. And what was applied by the UN then, the UN Secretariat, with the help of countries like Turkey in this case, was to use a technique. Let me tell the young people here around, because it's a technique that you may want to apply.
We have young over there as well. Otherwise, you're jealous.
May apply it for. Point number one, objective criteria. Say the situation in the war in Ukraine is actually affecting 200 million people. Do you want Ukraine and Russia have an impact on that negatively? There will be 200 million people who will have a terrible price with the grain and fertilizer. No, we don't want to. Fine. Then the next step, constructive embarrassment. If there is not a solution to this, there will be hunger, and you will be part of it by continuing war. Okay, then finding a partner. When the UN is weak at the Zirka, you can find a partner. It was Turkey in this case. And you had, you know what, the Black Sea formula or initiative, 22 million tons, and the grain price went down. It didn't last for too long, but it was enough for that. Conclusion, creativity is still possible.
You know, we love Staffan de Mistura.
Thank you.
For many reasons, but we always invite him, because whatever happens in the world, whatever gloomy scenario you have, he has a positive approach and note. So, a big approach to Staffan.
We have no alternative, you know that.
No. The same positive approach had Qatar when the war started. Also in partnership, as Staffan mentioned, or under the framework of the also of the UN Secretary General, you have been playing an important diplomatic role in the crisis, but at a certain point you gave up. And so as I said in this session, we want to be very optimistic but also very realistic. What were the main obstacles in your negotiation?
Well, Paolo, first of all, I have to say that we will never give up. And we have been very clear on this, even in our statement that announced the suspension of our efforts in the talks. And the reason we suspended these efforts, and the word suspended here is the most operative word, because we are willing immediately to go back to the negotiation table when we see willingness from both sides, is because at times, and I'm sure that Stefano agrees, the mediator needs to be wary of the fact if they are being used to prolong the conflict. And if the talks are being used as an alibi, as Stefano said yesterday, an alibi for those who don't want an end to the conflict. And therefore it is the responsibility of the mediator here to draw a line and say, this is where we stop, and we wait for you to change your positions, and we apply the pressure through the international community, as is happening right now, on both parties to do it. But if you allow me, Paolo, mediations are not guaranteed to succeed in any context. There are certain things that are necessary for mediations to happen. One of this, and one of the foremost reasons why mediations succeed, is when there is a minimum degree of willingness by parties to agree. When one of the two parties or both parties have zero interest in getting to agreement, no mediator in the world, however powerful it is, can create the situation for an agreement to happen. The other is rebuilding of trust. And this is where the role of the mediator is important but limited. Because when we have trauma that is at the level of what happened on the 7th of October and the ensuing war in Gaza and the genocide that's happening in Gaza, this trauma not only reduces trust, it establishes a position where trust becomes a crime, trust in the other. It becomes basically betrayal to your own people to have any trust in the other side. And obviously the lack of commitment also produced a lack of trust in the process itself. And then, unless you have clear objectives from both sides, what is needed to be negotiated over, then it is impossible for any mediator to come up with a deal. Because at the moment we can see very clearly that at least with one of the parties involved, there are no clear objectives. The line keeps moving. And we have seen it throughout the negotiation itself, where conditions change. When we work tirelessly, and our team has been working 24/7 on this since the 7th of October 2023. Whenever we get an agreement on whatever party said, this is what we want, this is what will get us to the table, you get new conditions being pre-imposed on the discussion itself. And then, those who lived through previous mediations in this context specifically know the importance of this point, which is what is happening on the field. Is one party under the impression that it is winning, and therefore not in the need to sign any agreement? And I think this is the reality here. I think Israel is emboldened by what has happened in Gaza, by what has happened in Lebanon, by its interactions with Iran, in a way that it has never happened since the inception of the State of Israel, where it is practically assassinating the leaders of all of its adversaries in one go within the span of a couple of months. And therefore that mirage of success, mirage of victory, it makes it impossible for a vision of peace to come forward. And this is why I think we took the decision to suspend the mediations, but I will make it very clear officially on behalf of my government, the moment we see commitment from both sides, you will see Qatar re-engaging fully in any role that we can play in peace resolution in this conflict.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was clear, very clear. Melita, you have a tough task now. Because what Staffan said on the UN, when you have broken pieces, they are brought to the UN, could apply to Europe as well. When there are broken pieces, and Europe maybe is not that involved in breaking the pieces, but the broken pieces are brought to Europe. And then we talk about reconstruction of Ukraine, and Europe should do that. Reconstruction of Syria, and Europe should do that. Reconstruction of Gaza, Europe should do that. And Lebanon. Without having a real voice in the process, in the mediation, in the negotiation, in the political arena. I was recently invited by a very good friend of mine who sits in this room to a meeting in a country, and there was to speak on a session on Europe and Europe and the Middle East, and the original title was Les Misérables. and my dear friend then readapted the title, but there was a point in that title, which means we have some problem in being effective. How can you react to this, a little bit of provocation?
Yeah, thank you for this provocative question. First of all, we were talking about being realistic, but also being optimistic. First thing I would say is we should not be so pessimistic about the European Union. Right now, of course, we have a new administration being formed, being established, so we'll see where we go. Now, we know that over the last few years, the European Union has integrated inwards. So we had the so-called Hamiltonian moment, our Hamiltonian moment, where we neutralized our debt. That is an important point. I'm talking now about the internal situation. We established cooperation in the fields where there wasn't one in existence before, such on energy, such on, medical issues and so forth. So I think it's important to put this out there, that the European Union has evolved in a positive way over the last years. And of course, we all know that the previous European Commission had as its goal to become more of a geostrategic player. the outgoing HRVP was talking about how Europe has to learn to speak the language of power. You may be aware of this adage that the European Union should not only be a payer, but also a player. When I say a payer, also important to put it out there that the European Union and its member states, the so-called Team Europe, actually contributes almost half of the official development aid in the world today, 45% or so. So this is something that we should not overlook. On the other hand, it was also a realization that we all subscribe to, that whatever we are investing through ODA, for example, needs to be coordinated better, but also a very important point that we have open discussion, open dialogue with our global partners, meaning we really look for synergies. We learn how to listen. When we are talking about the European Union as a geostrategic actor, there are juries out there how far we will progress on this path and how fast. But I would say that the aggression against Ukraine was a wake-up call. Perhaps also the elections in the US, the results of the elections, will garner are garnering additional momentum towards building a more geostrategic Europe. How long it will take, how much unity we can produce or we can achieve in the process, I cannot speculate about this, but one point that I would make is that perhaps sometimes this unity within the European Union is exaggerated because we have, it is a democratic institution, everything is out in the open, so we should also look at the actions and not only at the words. Perhaps also on the, again, a positive note, what the European Union has achieved since its creation, let's say, well, in whatever forms it existed over the decades after the Second World War, it did ensure peace on the continent.
Can I ask Staffan and Majed to have a comment on Europe as well? Because you mentioned, on Ukraine, we have clearly seen a unified front. We have, being a democratic institution, as you mentioned, we have seen different voices, different reluctancy, but in the end, even Orban have approved anything that Europe has decided in the last few years on Ukraine. But when we move to the Middle East and to this crisis, you can hardly say that the same unified front was existing. I would like to ask both of you what your perception was. You were playing this important role, and Staffan, you have seen Europe at the UN for decades. And are you seeing this more unified and strategic approach in acting within the Security Council and the UN in general?
Well, I'm biased. I'm very European, Italian, mother Swedish, married with a Belgian lady, children of French. I'm European, okay? So I'm very concerned when I see Europe not being taken seriously, because we need a strong Europe, unified or not unified, but strong in its own messaging. So far it's been, as Madame the Minister was rightly saying, more looked like a cash machine, and therefore there is time now to become, apart from being a moral player, become also a political player. And the time has come, and we are having a wake-up call. If Europe doesn't really become that, then they may become marginalized by the bigger players. And having said that, in the MENA, in Syria, when I was involved on that, and my colleague and friend Geir can testify for that, I'm sure, the fact that Europe was ready to put not only economic but political pressure due to the fact that they had a problem through the migration became an element which has been helping us to have a leverage in discussions. But we need more of that.
The point, and I move to you, of course, but being a cash machine without cash is tough. Because
yes.
What we will, I mean, it was interesting yesterday, I think you read that Germany is struggling with the Maastricht rules, Germany. So with the deficit and to approve. So it's something that we have to reflect on. How to be, will be a topic in next month, how to be a cash machine without cash. But my friend, what's your experience of Europe in this year of negotiation? Did you feel the power of Europe behind your exercise, or did you feel the same national protagonism which does not help all the time?
Well, first of all, Paolo, even a cash machine that is full is very problematic because the expectations of that cash machine is much higher.
And you are not talking about your country, of course.
So, and this is where I actually wanted to use it as a segue to say that it's very important for consortiums like the EU and the GCC to function in today's world. You know, we are the benefactors, the main benefactors of the international system, the middle powers of the world. The great power rivalry that is happening right now in the world is going to cause turmoil after turmoil after turmoil, as we have seen in the conflicts all throughout the past decade. And it is only with consortiums around peace, because we have failed to build a consensus around peace, but we have succeeded in building consortiums around peace by getting like-minded countries, especially in Europe and the Middle East, to work together to accomplish goals. You know, the first summit between the GCC and EU leaders in Brussels just a couple of months ago is a very good example of this. The G7 meeting yesterday here in Italy, or the day before, also is a very good example of this. We need to work together, and this is the only choice we have, is to work with bodies like the EU. Now, regardless of our assessment, we have our frustrations in the MENA region with EU policy. When it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Gaza war, I think both sides are not happy with the level of unity and double standards in both cases, and it's very important for us to work to resolve these issues together. But the role of the EU as a balancer in the international community today is a very important role, especially after what we have seen with the US election, after what we have seen even with elections here in Europe. It's very important to maintain these consortiums of peace and to utilize them together and to bring together all these like-minded countries to act as a cushion between the great powers in order to keep our world together. We're talking about to move to a multipolar world. I'm afraid that we're not moving to a multipolar world. Even the poles are failing. We are moving into complete chaos unless we collectively build these oases of stability and peace building.
Let's move into a second round of questions, which is mainly on the future of global governance, which we could debate for the next 22 days or 22 years. I used to teach 10 years ago international organization. You have been a guest of my courses a couple of times. And when I had to talk about the UN, I always brought to the classroom the UN chart, which it's a small blue booklet you can buy at the UN bookshop for $1. Now with inflation, Trump would say $2. But this small book, and on one side, and then I would bring 3 books as thick, which were published a few years ago on all the reform proposal of the UN chart. So the UN chart is 10 pages, and the reform proposal of the UN chart are like an encyclopedia, 4 huge books. So that's why we could talk for 2 years on this. But let's try to be focused on what could realistically be done to reform international organization, and I would talk mainly of the UN, to take into account this more fragmented world, global power competition on one side, and on the other side, the request from the global south, which is not new, we had in the 70s as well, to play a more relevant role. So let's imagine the next 2-3 years. What would you put on a timeline of action could be taken to improve, if not reform? You already said reform is impossible, international organization, and mainly the UN. Let me start, Staffan, with you as well, again.
Well, let's start, first of all, since we are dreaming together now, and you are helping me to dream, well, let's look at not the next 2-3 years, let's look at the next 3-4 months, okay? I've learned by experience that every time the two superpowers start talking to each other, transactionally perhaps, and we will see that, there is a change in the mood in the Security Council and everywhere else. You will remember the magic moment we had in Syria when Kerry and Lavrov did talk to each other. And they made a deal with the blessing of the UN. That's our role. We are supposed to bless and then pick up the pieces. It didn't work because there were spoilers, and those spoilers exist always. That's why timing is so important. But that was a moment. Now imagine, for some reason, based on what you all know will be happening after the 20th of January, that there may be a change in the atmospherics, and there will be some type of transactional discussions. You will start seeing that, in fact, the UN can become more efficient, at least in avoiding the paralysis. That's the first point. The second one, the UN has got more or less my age, okay? So it's pretty, not a baby. And we need refreshment here. And the refreshment is based on the fact that it was a photo Polaroid of 1945. For God's sake, with all due respect to those who won the Second World War, it does not represent the reality. Look at Africa, just to mention one continent. Secretary General is referring to it all the time. 1 billion people, no permanent seat. And the second reform needs to make it more embarrassing, more difficult for having veto used anytime by those 5 permanent members.
How can you do that?
Well, here is where I believe very much on the origin of the UN. We, the people. I don't hear the people at the moment, but we are waiting for the young people to start saying it. And we have been seeing it already. And that's why the General Assembly, in spite of what you rightly said, asked those votes which took place at the Security Council, at the General Assembly, they were embarrassing. They were a wake-up call in making it sure that the world was saying something different that the Security Council was not able to do. So, by the way, Paolo, if there is no UN, bad or non-perfect, as we all recognize, it will be just a jungle, chaos. So the best way is just to push it, hopefully through big powers to starting talking to each other differently, and all the others to be part of it. If nothing else, in finding some solution. Global issues, climate, poverty, COVID. Without the UN, no way to discuss it. So let's not be overambitious. Let's be proactive, taking advantage of any changes which are taking place in their geopolitical world, and there couldn't be one perhaps taking place with all concerns that we have. And if they start talking to each other, the Security Council, we will have probably more space. But we need some form of reform of the Security Council. The problem is that those who have the veto will veto any reform. So what you do when you have a problem like that, you try to bypass it.
And how do you put Trump into this picture? Will be eventually be, I'm sure you will say that you will find some positive note on this. That's why I'm asking, I'm serious. Would he be, in the end, an asset or also a liability, or both?
Paolo, you're talking to a UN official, I'm not a professor at the University Bocconi. So you're asking a naughty question. I will not be able to say you should ask him this question.
You know,
yeah. That's probably him calling you now.
You are being called, but I fear it's my fault.
Thank you anyway for
but
trying.
I tried.
No,
I tried.
Yes.
You are not UN officials. No, I'm not asking about Trump. No. How do you react to Staffan with his decades-long experience on how the UN can evolve in the next months or years to be more effective in global governance? Please, Melita.
Yes.
How Europe could help that process, by the way.
Yes. Thank you also for this additional aspect that you would like me to address. I'll start by saying, you know, Slovenia is a elected member of the Security Council, and we see firsthand how polarization is very negatively impacting the ability of the Security Council to work on delivering on peace and security. Today, we have the highest number of conflicts since the Second World War, which on the one hand really calls for an effective Security Council. On the one hand, on the other hand, it also exposes very clearly the, let's say, structural deficiency of the Security Council. To reform the Security Council, yes, in a way, we have this catch-22 with the veto power of the permanent members. On the other hand, as Excellency said, there are ways through which we could improve the functioning of the Security Council. It was kind of encouraging to see Slovenia as the presidency of the Security Council a couple of months ago. We organized this high-level event. I think it was around 130 leaders were at this event. Leadership for Peace, it was called. In this event, such a, I would say, two-thirds majority, if we're talking about the voice of the country's voice of the people, assumingly, actually recommitted to the principles of international law, the Charter itself. I think this was an important political message because to begin with the reform, first we have to have the political will. So how can we go about reforming and what can we do in the months and years to come? Here I would evoke the Pact for the Future. That was actually agreed upon with unanimity. It was a very difficult process. You can say that it's perhaps not specific enough and so forth, but this is a blueprint for us for the months and years to come. Among other things, this pact actually addresses the issue of the Security Council. Specifically, it stipulates or talks about 5 principles. The agreement is, I think we now are all on the same page, that there has to be expansion of the Security Council, as you, Excellency, mentioned. Of course, I mean, the last time we saw any kind of reform in the membership of the Security Council was in 1965. The world has changed since then. We do support Africa to have seats on the Security Council. We also are very much in favor of enlarging, well, basically increasing the representational power, the legitimacy in this sense, transparency, accountability of the Security Council. And I think this is kind of a blueprint that we do have, but now we have to put it in practice. So perhaps I would like to build on what you said and also Mr. Mistura said. regarding multipolarity. We talk a lot about geopolitical tensions, about this seismic moment in geostrategic structure of the world and so forth. But I would say, yes, if we have this multipolarity without multilateralism, yes, we are subscribing to chaos. Chaos, and that's why we are not only as a smaller state, but I think every state in this world, no matter its size, should subscribe to the idea that multilateralism, with the UN at its center, should be made more effective. And so we should all work on this. We, Slovenia, of course, we are part of the European Union. We very much also support the role of regional organizations and advocating for enhancing, for deepening the links between the regional organizations such as GCC, such as the African Union, the Arab League, and so forth, with the United Nations. We have to take advantage of the existing regional organizations as well, make them more efficient, but also, that they feed their solutions into the UN system as well.
Thank you. We have a few minutes before the end of the session. We mentioned, Staffan, and not only Staffan, many times that the room is full of young people.
Yes.
Most of the young people in the room are students, not all of them, students at ISP. They are studying diplomacy. And we have been discussing wars, which means the lack of diplomacy, effective diplomacy in the last few years. And I want to close on a positive note with them. I will ask you to talk to them now, to give a message of hope, realistic hope. Because, the students we have here, approximately, they are not all the same age, but their mother was pregnant when the Twin Towers were destroyed, or immediately after. They were young children, they were going to primary school when the debt crisis in Europe was a big issue, and we became poorer. And then they moved to university when COVID prevented them to go to university. And then now they graduated during two wars. The war in Ukraine, the one we talk about, there are so many as you mentioned, but the one we are giving attention. And they are studying diplomacy in spite of all this background. So I ask you, you have 1 minute each to give a realistic and optimistic reason of hope for future diplomats or future leader of the world. We don't care if they are diplomats in the end. Can I ask you to start?
Sure. I mean, the most important message here is that when we talk about the international system, the UN is a plate. But however fancy the plate is, it's not going to affect the quality of the food. And therefore, when we look at the international community today, it is the sum of what we all collectively do together as individuals, institutions, states, and coalitions and consortiums. But the important thing is, don't look at the pessimistic headline as the only thing that is happening in the world today. The UN and the international organizations and players in the international organizations were able to solve a lot of mini crises around the world because of collective action, because of the work we do together. The work between NGOs and the international organizations has helped us to do that also. And finally, you can never lose hope, because if that happens, there is no hope for the world as a whole. And therefore, it is your responsibility, as it was our responsibility and the responsibility of those before us, to keep hope alive by effecting change. And unless we effect change individually, wherever we are, we cannot ask for the world to become a better place.
Good, thank you. Melita, please.
Well, the role of diplomacy is as important, if not more important than it ever was. Every war ends with diplomacy That's on the one hand, we're talking about these wars, these horrible wars that we live through. But of course, diplomacy is also a way of preventing wars, preventing conflicts. So I would say diplomacy is a noble calling. It's really a mission, it's a way of life, but it is also a difficult calling, but it is an important one. And when I see so many young diplomats in the making, it gives me hope. And I think that also when you read the media, you also have to keep in mind that emphasis is on the conflict, on the negative side of things. Positive things happen, but they just do not, also due to diplomatic efforts, due to the efforts of international organizations, the UN, the EU, countries and so on, but you will not see that necessarily in the media. So do not think that diplomacy is any less important or that it will be any less important down the road. So you chose well.
The future diplomats are all desperately trying to find wood, to touch wood. The floor is wooden, so because you can touch the floor. Staffan, you have the closing remarks.
Thank you.
And 1 minute.
We were, you, okay? We had your age. And imagine if before us, we were born in 1900, we would have seen First World War, Second World War, leaders, things looking gloomy. Remember that the humanity, if we are engaged, and you need to be engaged and committed, we need you involved and knowledgeable. The humanity has this capacity. Yesterday we had a ceasefire. And what appeared to be an impossible mission. Well, we may have an epidemic now of ceasefires, inshallah, God willing.
Inshallah.
And that is the type of thing that should give us hope. The bottom line is, believe and be positive and proactive. The alternative doesn't exist. Don't get disengaged. That's the main point.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And please, let's start the next session.